The third week of November, the long gallery at Stourcombe Hall had been lit with 200 candles, and not one of them had been lit for her. Wilhelmina stood at the foot of the staircase in a gown of pale grey silk she had not chosen, and watched her own husband move through a crowd that had been gathered to witness her failure. The musicians played a country air. The footman carried silver, and at the far end of the gallery, beneath the painted ceiling, her late father-in-law had commissioned 3 young men in new coats stood in a row, waiting to be presented as the future of a house that had refused to acknowledge her for 5 years. She did not weep. She had learned in those 5 years the precise economy of stillness, the way a woman could hold her spine straight enough that no one in the room could measure what it cost her. Bramwell had told her to wear gray. He had told her to stand where the light fell, so that everyone might see the wife who could not give him a son. What he had not told her was that he meant to call the gathering a celebration, and to make her the silence at the center of it. A footman passed with a tray of ratafia and small glasses of negus, and he hesitated before her, the way the servants always hesitated now, uncertain whether the mistress of the house was still a person to be offered things or a thing to be carried past. She took nothing. She let her hand stay folded at her waist, the right gloved over the left, the way her mother had taught her to stand in church when she was small, and the sermon ran long, and she fixed her eyes on a point above the heads of the crowd, on the painted ceiling where her late father-in-law had had himself rendered as a Roman senator among clouds. And she breathed slowly, and she counted as she had counted at 100 sick-beds, until the worst of the trembling in her chest went still. Near the cold hearth at the gallery's center, 2 women she had dined beside a dozen times bent their heads together and looked at her and looked away, and one of them lifted her fan, and behind the fan the old phrase passed between them that the whole county used for her, the one the dowager had coined, and the county had taken up. Wilhelmina had learned to read it on lips she could not hear. She had learned a great many things in 5 years that no physician's daughter in Asherton had ever thought to need. You may wonder why a woman would consent to stand in such a room at all. Stay with this, because the answer is not the one the crowd believed. To begin properly, one must go back 6 years to a different November, when Wilhelmina Thorne was 23 and the daughter of a country physician with more learning than money. She had grown up in a narrow stone house in the village of Asherton, among her father's books and her father's patients, and she had learned to set a fracture, and to read a fever, and to keep her own counsel before she had ever learned to dance. When Lord Bramwell Hale, Baron of Stourcombe, had ridden into the village with a wound in his thigh that his own surgeon had bungled, it had been the physician's daughter who cleaned it and stitched it and saved the leg, and very likely the man. He had courted her through the long convalescence with a charm she had mistaken for depth. For 3 weeks he had kept to the physician's house while the thigh healed, and for 3 weeks he had asked her to read to him in the afternoons, and she had read him the only books the house owned, which were treatises on bones and fevers and the setting of joints. And he had laughed and said he had never met a woman who could name every bone in a man's hand, and not blush to do it. He had told her that he did not care for fortune, that he wanted a wife of sense and not of settlement. He had said it sitting up against the pillows, with the autumn light on his face, and she had been 23, and had never been told by a handsome man that her learning was the thing he wanted, and she had believed him because she was young, and because no one had taught her, that a charming man and a kind one are not always the same man. They married in the spring, in the small church at Asherton, with her father giving her away, and the whole village turned out to see one of their own, taken up by a Barren. She came to Stourcombe Hall a week later, in a borrowed traveling cloak, with one trunk and her father's medical case set on the seat beside her. And the dowager who ruled the house from a wing of cold rooms came out to the gravel sweep to meet the carriage, looked once at the trunk and once at the case, and said loud enough for the footman to hear that the new baroness had brought her dowry in a leather bag. The dowager was Lady Hale, Bramwell's mother, a woman of 60, whose every sentence was a small blade kept polished against the day it would be wanted. She had governed Stourcombe for 40 years, first as a young bride who had brought a fortune of her own, and then as the widow who held the household keys past the age when most women surrendered them, and she had never in all that time met a difficulty she could not name into its proper place. From the first hour she had a name for her son's wife, and she used it freely. She had coined a phrase for the physician's daughter within a week of the wedding, and let it loose into the county like a hound, and the county had taken it up gladly. And it had fastened itself to Wilhelmina, the way a burr fastens to wool. She said it the way another woman might name a stain on the linen, without heat, and without ever quite raising her voice. And that was the worst of it, that the cruelty came so quietly dressed. It would be a comfort to say the dowager was a monster, but she was not. And the truth is harder. She believed entirely and without cruelty, as she understood the word, that an ancient house was a thing held in trust against the carelessness of the living, and that a physician's daughter let into it was a crack in the wall through which the cold would come. She had been raised to that belief by a mother who had been raised to it, and the belief had served her in every room she had ever entered, and it did not occur to her, because it had never once been required to occur to her, that the woman she named might be worth more than the wall. She was not wicked. She was certain. And certainty, in a house where one person holds the keys, is the harder thing to live beneath. There was a morning in the second winter that Wilhelmina did not afterward forget. She had risen before the household to mix a salve for a kitchen maid whose hands had cracked and bled at the wash, the same plain salve her father had made of lard and calendula in the narrow house at Asherton, and the dowager had come upon her in the still room with her sleeves pushed up and her fingers greasy, and had stood in the doorway and watched, and had said, in the gentle, confiding tone she kept for her sharpest strokes, that the apothecary's girl might dress every chapped hand in the parish, and it would not give the house the one thing the house required of her. Then she had gone in to her chocolate, and Wilhelmina had finished the salvand. The kitchen maid's hands had healed, and the dowager's sentence had stayed in the still-room air for years, the way some words do. For the first year it had not mattered so much, because Bramwell had still wanted her. Then the year turned, and there was no child. Then a second year turned the same way. The physicians the dowager summoned, men with London reputations and London fees, examined the Baroness with cold hands and colder conclusions, and could find nothing, and so they did what such men do, which was to decide the fault must lie with the woman because the woman could not argue with them. Wilhelmina, who had read more medicine than any of them by candlelight in Asherton, held her tongue and let them be wrong, because she had learned that a baroness who corrected a London physician earned nothing but a longer sentence. By the fourth year, Bramwell no longer came to her rooms. By the fifth, he no longer pretended to. And the dowager, sensing the wind, began to speak of the entail. Here's the thing about Stourcombe that the gallery full of guests did not fully understand, though it governed every life under that roof. The barony itself was Bramwell's outright, his to spend and mortgage and ruin as he pleased, and he had done a fair portion of all three. The larger estate, however, the farms and the woods and the great house itself, was held under a settlement made 2 generations back by a more careful man, and that settlement did not pass to Bramwell freely. It passed through the hands of the head of the elder branch of the family, the Earl of Marlcaster, who held the trust, and the final word on who, after Bramwell, would inherit the land. Bramwell might wish to disinherit his wife, and name an heir of his own choosing. He could not do it with a wish. He could do it only if Marlcaster confirmed it. The Earl of Marlcaster was a man Wilhelmina had met exactly twice, at 2 Christmas gatherings, and both times he had said almost nothing to her, and both times she had come away with the strange impression that he had seen more of her than anyone else in the room. His name was Gideon Ravensworth. He was 38, a widower of 4 years, and the county said of him that he was cold, that grief had frozen him, that he had not danced nor laughed nor courted since his wife died in childbed, and the child with her. He kept to his own seat at Marlcaster Court, and managed 3 estates with a precision that left no room for warmth, and the marriage-minded mothers of the county had long since given him up as a lost cause and a colder fish than any sea had produced. What the county did not know, because the county judged by surfaces, was that the Earl of Marlcaster had watched a gray-eyed woman set a child's broken wrist at a Christmas gathering 2 years before, quietly, in a side room, while the rest of the house danced, and had not been able to put the picture down since. It had been a steward's boy, 6 years old, who had fallen on the back stairs chasing a kitchen cat while his betters danced, and the bone of the small wrist had gone the wrong way, and the boy had screamed, and the company in the great hall had not so much as turned its powdered heads. Gideon had been standing apart, as he always stood apart, near a window where the cold came through, and he had followed the sound because the sound was the only true thing in the house that night, and he had found the Baroness of Stourcombe already kneeling on the stone in her good gown with the boy's wrist in her 2 hands. She had not summoned a surgeon. She had set the bone herself, with a strip torn from her own petticoat and a flat of kindling for a splint, talking to the boy the whole while in a low, steady voice about a dog she had once owned, and the boy had stopped screaming, and she had not once looked up to see whether anyone of consequence was watching her do it. Gideon had stood in the doorway and watched a woman do a hard and tender thing for no audience at all, and he had gone back to Marlcaster Court 2 days later and managed his estates with his usual cold precision, and he had carried the picture of her kneeling on that stone with him for 2 years like a stone of his own in his pocket, taking it out when he was alone and not knowing why he could not throw it away. That, though, is the middle of the story, and we are not there yet. We are in the autumn of the 5th year, when Bramwell summoned his wife to the library and told her with the particular ease of a man who has rehearsed a cruelty until it sounds like reason, that he intended to settle the matter of the succession once and for all. He had, he said, 3 young men whose claims he meant to advance. One was a distant cousin, a Hale of the Norfolk line. One was the son of an old friend, a young man named Ashby, whom Bramwell intended to adopt as his ward and heir. And one, he said, watching her face, was his own. A boy of 19, got on a woman in a market town in the year before his marriage, raised quietly at Bramwell's expense, and now to be brought forward and acknowledged. He told her this in the cold November light, turning a paperweight in his hand, and then he told her the rest. He would gather the county. He would present all 3. He would make it known in the most public and most unanswerable way that the house of Stourcombe did not lack for heirs, that the lack was hers alone, the physician's daughter who had brought a leather bag for a dowry and had given him nothing in 5 years but the embarrassment of her presence. The dowager had suggested the gathering. The dowager had even suggested the grey gown. Wilhelmina stood very still. She asked him only one question. She asked whether the boy, the son of 19, knew that he was being used as a knife. Bramwell did not answer, which was an answer. She did not refuse to attend. This is the part the crowd could not understand, and the part you must, because everything turns on it. She might have fled to Asherton, to the narrow house where her father, now old and half-blind, still kept his books. She might have refused the gown and locked her door. Yet Wilhelmina had spent 5 years learning that this house held people who could be hurt worse than she could, and chief among them was a 19-year-old boy who had done nothing but be born, and who was about to be paraded into a gallery full of strangers as a living reproach to a woman he had never met. Were she to flee, the boy would still be presented. He would simply be presented without one person in the room who saw him as a person. So she stayed. She put on the grey gown, and she went down to the gallery to stand in the light because there was a child of sorts in that room who needed a steady adult more than she needed her own dignity intact. That was the first lesson the night would teach, though only one man in the gallery understood it as it happened. The Earl of Marlcaster had been invited as a courtesy, and Bramwell had assumed he would not come. Earls of Marlcaster did not, as a rule, travel 2 days in November to attend a baron's family. Gideon, however, had read the invitation twice. He had noted the word celebration where no birth, no betrothal, and no honor explained it. He had remembered a gray-eyed woman setting a child's wrist in a quiet room, and he had ordered his carriage. He arrived late when the candles had burned down an inch, and the gallery was full, and he came in without announcement and stood at the edge of the crowd in a plain dark coat, and the first thing he saw was the Baroness at the foot of the stairs, alone in a ring of people who were all careful not to stand too near her. He saw the grey gown. He understood. in the way that intelligent men understand cruelty, exactly what the gown was for. Across the gallery, Bramwell raised his hand for quiet, and the musicians stopped, and the gathering turned toward the three young men in their new coats. The dowager moved to her son's side, diamonds at her throat, and her gaze found Wilhelmina across the room and held it, and her mouth made the small satisfied line of a woman watching a long plan come to fruition. To the dowager, the night was a correction. The house had been embarrassed by an unsuitable wife, and the embarrassment was about to be answered. Bramwell began to speak. He spoke of duty, and of continuance, and of the obligation a man of his station owed to his name. He spoke well, having practiced, and the crowd listened, and one by one he brought the three young men forward. The Norfolk cousin, a sturdy fellow with a horseman's hands. The ward, young Ashby, pink with the attention. And then the third, the boy of 19, slight and dark and visibly frightened, who came forward when his name was called and stood under 200 candles, with the look of someone who has been told what to do but not what it means. Bramwell turned to the crowd. He said that here were three young men of merit, any of whom might do honor to the house. He said that a man wanting an heir need not want for choices. And then he looked deliberately across the gallery, to where his wife stood in gray, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, that it was a fortunate thing the house had not been left to depend on what some women could provide. The crowd did not laugh. It was worse than laughter. It rustled, a sound of 200 people deciding at once where to put their eyes, and not one pair of them came to rest on her with anything she could have used. Somewhere to her left, a man's voice, lowered but not lowered enough, said to his neighbor that it was no more than one might expect of an apothecary's girl raised up past her station, and the neighbor murmured agreement, and the murmur traveled. And Wilhelmina heard her name unmade a second time that night, in a room she could not leave. Wilhelmina stood in the light, and did not move. She did not look at her husband, she looked at the boy. He had heard the word "some women," and he was clever enough to understand that he had just been made a weapon, and his frightened face had gone from frightened to something worse. The particular sickness of a young person who realizes he is the instrument of a cruelty, and cannot step out of his own coat. He looked in that moment at the only still point in the room. He looked at her. And Wilhelmina, the woman in gray they had gathered to shame, did the thing that changed the night. She crossed the gallery. Not quickly, not in a rush of feeling, but at her own unhurried pace, the whole room watching, and she went to the boy of 19, and she stopped in front of him, and she did not address her husband or the dowager or the county. She spoke to the boy alone, in a voice that did not need to carry, but carried anyway in the held silence of the room. She asked him his name. The crowd had not expected a question. Bramwell had not scripted one. The boy, startled, said his name was Daniel. She said then that she was glad to know it, and that whatever brought him into this room tonight he was not the cause of anything wrong in it, and that he might stand a little straighter because no fault in this house was his. She said it quietly, with no performance in it, the plain, steady sentence of a woman who had spent her girlhood telling frightened patients the truth. She had said the like of it to a blacksmith with a crushed thumb, and to a child burning with fever, and to her own mother at the last, the simple, true words a frightened person needs, which are never clever and never grand. And she put out her gloved hand and rested it, briefly on the boy's sleeve, the way one steadies someone who has been made to feel he is falling. The boy's breath changed. She felt it through her glove, the small shudder of a young man who has been holding himself rigid against tears in front of strangers and is undone not by cruelty, but by the first kindness shown him in a cruel hour. He did not weep. He mastered it as she had taught herself to master things, and he stood a little straighter, as she had told him to. And the slight squaring of his thin shoulders under his new coat was, to the one or two people near enough to see it, a worse indictment of the evening than any speech could have been. Here was the weapon the Baron had brought into his gallery, and the weapon had a name, and the weapon was a frightened boy, and a woman in gray had just reminded the whole room of it, without saying a single word against anyone. It was a small thing, It was, in the arithmetic of the gallery, almost nothing. The room, though, had been arranged to display a woman's shame, and instead the room was watching a woman show a frightened boy. A mercy that no one had thought to show him, and the arrangement began, very quietly, to come apart. The Earl of Marcaster, at the edge of the crowd, did not move and did not speak. Something in his still face changed, even so, the way ice changes over a river when the water beneath it begins to run, and a man standing near him would have seen his jaw set and his eyes fix on the woman in gray as though she were the only lit thing in a hall of 200 candles. You see it now, perhaps. The crowd did not yet. Let us go on. Bramwell, robbed of his tableau, did what cornered men do, which was to press harder. He said, with an edge now sharpening his practiced ease, that his wife's tenderness for strange young men was touching, and that perhaps if she had directed such warmth where a wife owed it, the house would not have needed this gathering at all. The dowager smiled. It was a clean stroke, and it landed, and the crowd rustled again. Wilhelmina turned from the boy. For the first time that evening she looked at her husband, directly across the length of the gallery, and she answered him. And her voice was not loud, but the room had gone so quiet that a whisper would have carried. She said that she had given him 5 years, his name, her father's good name, and her silence under his mother's roof, and that she had never once in all that time told anyone in that county what she knew about the bungled wound in his thigh, and how near he had come to losing the leg and whose unfashionable hands had saved it. She said she would not tell them now. She said it not as a threat, but as a fact, set down plainly, the way she had set down the truth at 100 sickbeds. And the crowd, which had been so sure it knew the shape of this marriage, heard for the first time that the Baron of Stauricum owed his sound left leg to the woman he had dressed in gray to shame. It was the truth, and it could not be unheard. Bramwell's face went white, then red. The dowager's smile did not so much fall as freeze. And into the silence that followed, a voice spoke from the edge of the gallery that no one had marked. A level voice, unhurried, accustomed to being obeyed. The Earl of Marcaster said that he thought he had heard enough. The crowd turned as one. The Earl came forward to the parting guests, and the change in the room was immediate and physical, the way a room changes when the person with the real authority in it finally chooses to use it. Bramwell, who had built the whole evening on the assumption that the head of his family would not trouble to attend, watched the head of his family walk the length of the gallery toward him with an expression that had nothing in it of family feeling. Gideon stopped in the open space where the 3 young men still stood. He looked at the boy Daniel, and then at the ward, and then at the Norfolk cousin, and then at Bramwell. He said that since the gathering had been called to settle the succession, he would settle it, as was his right and his alone to do, the estate being held in his trust, and passing at his word, and at no one else's. He said it plainly, and the dowager's frozen smile cracked, because she had known, of course, she had known, that the entail ran through Marlcaster. But she had not thought he would invoke it here, tonight, in front of the county, against her own son. He said that he had listened to a man stand in his own gallery and call a gathering a celebration in order to shame his wife, and that he had watched that wife cross a room to comfort a frightened boy her husband had used as a knife, and that he had seen in the course of 1/4 of an hour exactly which person in the house of Stauricum possessed the qualities that the keeping of an estate actually required. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Bramwell, recovering something of himself, said that the Earl could have no notion of what had passed in this marriage, that there were matters of which a guest could not judge. Gideon agreed that he could not judge a marriage. He said he was not there to judge a marriage. He was there to determine an inheritance, and on that question he had heard everything he required. Then the dowager spoke, because the dowager was not a woman to surrender a field she had spent 5 years preparing. She came forward, diamonds bright, and she said with all the polished steel she owned that the Earl was being sentimental over a pretty piece of theater, that the woman he admired had come to this house with a leather bag for a dowry, and had failed in the one duty a baroness owed, and that no quantity of charming kindness to a stranger's son could mend a barren marriage or make a fit mistress of a country surgeon's child. She said the words apothecary's girl, the same words she had once let fall in a still room, and that a guest had let travel across the gallery not a quarter of an hour before, and she said them this time to the highest-ranking man in the room, certain that rank would hear rank. It was the wrong room and the wrong man. The dowager did not yet know it, and she pressed her case with the full confidence of a woman whose script had worked in every drawing-room in the county for 40 years. Gideon let her finish. Then he asked her a question, the way Wilhelmina had asked the boy his name. Quiet and exact. He asked the dowager whether she knew that the physicians she had hired to examine her son's wife had each been paid, in addition to their fee, a further sum to find the fault in the woman and to look no further. He asked it, as a man asks a thing he already knows the answer to, and the answer was on the dowager's face before she governed it, the single flinch of a person caught at the precise point she believed was hidden. Then he told the room how he knew, because the climax of a true thing must be a thing the listener can trace. He said that one of those London physicians, an honest man, troubled by what he had been paid to conclude, had written to the head of the family some months past, because the matter touched an inheritance, and that the head of the family read his correspondence. The dowager's overreach had reached the one person in England with both the right and the will to weigh it. The gallery was utterly silent now. Bramwell looked at his mother. The crowd looked at the dowager. And the dowager, who had armored herself in certainty for 60 years, found that the armor did not answer to her, and her hands, which had never once trembled in public, closed on nothing. Gideon turned from her. He had displaced her without raising his hand, and he did not press the advantage past the point her own overreach had earned. He turned instead to Wilhelmina, who had stood through all of it in her gray gown without moving, and the whole gallery turned with him, and for the first time that night every pair of eyes in the room came to rest on her with something she could have used. He crossed the floor to her. He stopped in front of her, a careful and proper distance, and he did the smallest possible thing, and the largest. He inclined his head to her, as a man inclines his head to a woman whose rank. He acknowledges and he spoke her name. Not the phrase the dowager had coined, not the Baroness. Her own name, her given name, said once deliberately. In the hearing of the county that had spent 5 years refusing to use it, he said, Mina. And then, in the silence that single word had made, he offered her his arm, and asked, in a voice the whole room heard, whether she would permit him to see her safely from a house that had not deserved her. She looked at the offered arm. She looked at the boy Daniel, who had moved, without being told, to stand a little nearer to her, the only soul in that room to instinctively take her side. She looked, last, at her husband, who had built 200 candles into a monument to her unworth, and was now watching the head of his own family lead his wife away in front of the county. There was nothing in her face of triumph, only the great fatigue of a woman setting down a weight she had carried too long. She rested her gloved hand on the Earl's offered arm, and she said to Daniel that he was to come with them, that no one would use him so again. And the boy came, and the three of them walked the length of the gallery together and out through the doors into the cold November night, and the 200 candles burned on behind them in a room that no longer had a story to tell. That, you may think, is the end. It is not. The end is quieter, and it is the part that matters most. The law is slow, even when the truth is plain. It took the better part of a year. The honest physician swore his account before men who could record it. The dowager, faced with the choice between a public reckoning and a quiet withdrawal, chose the quiet withdrawal, as such women generally do, and removed to a small house in Bath, where she could be confidently wrong among strangers who had not yet learned the shape of her. Bramwell, his cruelty made plain, and his estate confirmed by Marlcaster's word to pass elsewhere, found that a county which had rustled at his jokes would no longer dine at his table, and discovered, too late, that a man's reputation is the only inheritance he truly controls. The marriage was set aside. This was not simple, and it was not quick, and Wilhelmina endured a year of careful proceedings with the same straight spine she had carried into the gallery. and she did not, in all that year, speak one ungenerous word of the man she had saved a leg for. She went home to Asherton first, to the narrow stone house, and she nursed her father through his last winter, and she set Daniel up as an apprentice to a good apothecary in the county town, the trade being a respectable one, and the boy having a careful hand. And she asked nothing of anyone while the law did its slow work. And the Earl of Marlcaster came to Asherton. He came in the spring, when the proceedings were nearly done, and he did not come in a great carriage with a great announcement. He came on horseback, alone, and he tied the horse at the gate of the narrow stone house, and he knocked at the door of a physician's cottage, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for the head of an ancient family to do. Wilhelmina opened the door in an apron, with her hands smelling of the willow bark tea she had been steeping for an old woman's joints, and she looked at the man on the step, and the man on the step looked at her, and neither of them said anything clever, because the moment did not want anything clever. He told her, standing at the gate among the early daffodils, the thing he had carried since a side room 2 Christmases past. He told her that he had watched her set a child's wrist while a house danced, and that he had gone home and managed 3 estates and buried a grief, and told himself he felt nothing, and that he had read an invitation to a celebration, and known before he could have explained how, that he had to be in that gallery. He said that he had spent 4 years believing himself frozen through, and that he had stood at the edge of a cruel room and watched a woman in grey cross, a floor to comfort a frightened boy, and had felt the ice over the river give way all at once. He said it plainly, level and unadorned, a man unused to saying such things and saying them anyway. She listened, and when he had finished, she did not pretend, as a more guarded woman might, that she had not understood him, or had not in her own careful and disbelieving way watched the same thing happen in herself. She told him the truth, which was that she had spent 5 years being told what she was by people who had never once asked, and that the strangest thing about the gallery, stranger than the grey gown and the 3 heirs and the 200 candles, was that the only man in the room who had used her name had been a man she had met twice, and spoken to scarcely at all, and that she had not been able to put the sound of it down since. He asked her then. Not in a gallery, not before a county, but at a cottage gate among the daffodils, with no one to witness it but an old woman waiting inside for her willow bark tea. He asked whether she would come to Marlcaster, not as anyone's correction and not as anyone's reproach, but as the mistress of a house that had been cold for 4 years and wanted warming. He asked it as a question, fully a question, leaving her the whole of the answer, the first man in 6 years to leave her anything entire. She said yes. She said it the way she did everything quietly, and once, and meaning it. They married in the early summer in the small church at Asherton, where her father had worshipped and where the physician, too frail now to give her away, sat in the front pew with his half-blind eyes turned toward the sound of his daughter's voice, and Daniel stood up beside the groom, scrubbed and proud in a coat that fit him. And there were perhaps 30 people in the church, and not one of them had come to watch a woman fail. There was no child of their own bodies. The county had been right about that much, and all the willow bark wisdom her father had taught her could not change it. And neither of them ever pretended otherwise or grieved it in a way that poisoned what they had. Marlcaster Court, though, had long held the keeping of an estate, and an estate is full of lives. And in the years that followed, the new countess filled the cold house with the kind of life she understood. She turned a disused wing into rooms where the tenant's sick could be tended, and she taught the village women what her father had taught her. And she made of the great house something it had not been in living memory, which was a place where people came to be made well rather than to be judged. The county that had rustled in a gallery learned, slowly, in the way counties learn, to call her by her name. On a winter evening some years on, the Earl and Countess of Marlcaster sat by a fire in a room that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and Daniel, grown now and steady in his trade, had come to dine and had stayed late, and the talk had wound down into the comfortable quiet of people who no longer needed to fill a silence to feel safe in it. Snow had begun against the windows. Gideon had her hand in his, the same gloved hand she had once laid on a frightened boy's sleeve, ungloved now, and roughened a little by good work, and he turned it over in the firelight the way a man turns a thing he has decided never to set down. Outside, the snow came down over 3 estates and a county, and a small house in Bath and a cold gallery at Stourcombe where the candles had long since guttered out. Inside, the fire held. And Wilhelmina, who had once been told by 200 candles exactly what she was worth, sat in the warm dark, with her hand in her husband's, and was at last in a house that had a use for everything she was. If her quiet courage stayed with you, I hope you will carry it a moment longer before the night takes it back. Some verdicts the world hands down are simply wrong, and now and then we are given the great mercy of living long enough to watch a truer one delivered.